They didn't have irrigation systems, no pumps, no hoses, just dust, sweat, and survival in the harshest years of drought. When noble banquets carried on as usual, peasants stared at cracked soil, praying their next harvest wouldn't starve them, yet somehow they found a way. Using age-old knowledge and grit, they planted crops that needed almost nothing, yet gave just enough to live another season. What were these mysterious plants? And how did medieval farmers master the art of growing without water? This is the forgotten science of survival, rooted in the dust of the Dark Ages. In medieval Europe, survival often came down to soil, weather, and luck. For the vast majority of the population, peasants tied to the land there were no guarantees. Rain didn't follow calendars, and the earth didn't yield easily. Across the continent, the threat of drought loomed constantly, especially in regions where rainfall was scarce or unreliable. In the Mediterranean south, summers stretched long and dry. Southern Italy, Spain, and parts of southern France often saw little rain during critical growing months. Without irrigation, fields baked under the sun, and only the most resilient crops stood a chance. In contrast, Northern Europe, England, Scandinavia, the Low Countries saw more rainfall, but it came with its own challenges: unpredictable timing, waterlogged soil, and cold snaps that could ruin an entire yield. Farming techniques were basic. Across regions, with heavy plows in the north and scratch plows in the south. But in both cases, the farmer's success depended on the whims of nature. Across this varied landscape, one reality remained the same. Irrigation was nearly non. Outside of a few monastic estates or Roman-influenced regions where remnants of aqueducts or canal systems survived, most medieval peasants relied entirely on rainfall. Water had to come from above. If it didn't, there were no alternative pumps, no wells deep enough to sustain crops on a large scale. A dry year didn't just mean hardship, it could mean death. The social order made it worse. Peasants, who made up over 80% of the population, rarely owned the land they worked. Instead, they toiled under the authority of local lords, church estates, or royal domains. The best, most fertile lands were usually reserved for noble estates. What remained, the rocky slopes, marshy patches, and drought-prone fields, fell to those at the bottom of the hierarchy. Even then, peasants owed rents, taxes, and labor, regardless of the harvest's outcome. A failed crop wasn't simply a financial loss. It meant a winter without bread, children without food, and families pushed into debt or starvation. Grain yields were already low by modern standards. A successful harvest might produce 3 to 5 times the amount of seed sown. In a bad year, that ratio could collapse. In extreme droughts, like those recorded in the late 13th century across France and England, entire villages faced famine. Communities relied heavily on what little they could grow, what they could preserve, and what they could forage. There was no state support system, and famine relief, when it existed, was patchy and slow. These realities forced a strategic approach to agriculture. Farmers didn't just plant what they wanted, they planted what they knew might survive. Drought-resistant crops, though often lower in prestige and yield, became the backbone of subsistence. Grains like barley and rye, legumes such as peas and beans, and hardy vegetables like onions and leeks became vital. These were crops that could germinate in shallow soil, mature quickly, and resist failure in dry or nutrient-poor conditions. Over time, generations of farmers developed a rough but effective understanding of crop rotation, soil preservation, and moisture retention. It was born not from theory, but from centuries of watching fields wither and adapt. In dry climates, they planted early in spring to catch what little rainfall might come. In northern regions, they staggered sowing to avoid total ruin from a late frost. Each decision was calculated against the risk of failure. This was farming. As survival, no machinery, no fertilizers, no second chances. Just a man, a wooden plow, a pair of oxen if he was lucky on the unforgiving soil beneath him. Every seed planted was a gamble, and every harvest a judgment. To survive, medieval farmers learned to trust the hardiest, cheapest crops that needed little, asked for nothing, and gave just enough to keep their children alive. In medieval Europe, barley was not a luxury, it was necessity. For the lower classes who bore the brunt of poor soils, inconsistent rainfall, and minimal resources, barley became a dependable ally. Its resilience in drought-prone regions made it one of the few grains that could be counted on when others failed. Barley required little water compared to wheat and oats. It could grow in light, sandy, or rocky soil terrain, often considered too poor for other staple crops. Its adaptability made it a favorite in regions from the British Isles to Central Europe, particularly in areas where rainfall was sparse or unpredictable. The crop's short growing season was another advantage, while wheat demanded a longer, more stable climate cycle. Barley could be harvested in as little as 90 days, giving farmers a quicker return and reducing the risk of total loss during dry spells. For peasant households, barley was more than just a backup hit, was a foundation. The grain was used in daily meals, usually in the form of thick gruel or coarse bread. These were not delicacies, but sources of calories that sustained families through labor and famine alike. In areas like Anglo-Saxon England, barley bread was a common feature on the table of the average tenant farmer, baked in communal ovens or over open hearths. Its importance extended beyond food. Barley was the backbone of medieval fermentation. Ale, brewed primarily from barley, was a crucial part of the medieval diet, not only for its calories, but because it provided a safer alternative to often contaminated water sources, even small. Villagers maintained brewing traditions. Alewives, women responsible for household brewing, relied on barley mash as a standard base for their production. In monasteries, where brewing was more systematized, barley helped support entire communities, both economically and nutritionally. Records from the Domesday Book in 1086 reveal how widespread barley cultivation was across England, often listed alongside oats and rye as core agricultural products. On manorial estates, barley fields were maintained both for direct consumption and for fulfilling feudal obligations through rent or tithe. Barley didn't symbolize prestige. It wasn't a noble crop, but its resilience under soil, limited water, short seasons made it indispensable. In a world where the failure of a single harvest could mean starvation, barley endured. It was the grain of survival. Rye was a grain of compromise, hardier than wheat, cheaper than barley, and capable of growing in land others abandoned. For the medieval peasant, it offered a dependable, if not ideal, means of survival. Unlike wheat, which demanded fertile soil and steady rainfall, rye tolerated the marginal terrain. It thrived in sandy, acidic soils where other crops failed, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, the Germanic lands, and across parts of Scandinavia. Its resilience to drought and frost made it essential in northern climates. Farmers in the Baltic regions, the Polish plains, and Germanic territories leaned heavily on rye during colder growing seasons. Winter rye, sown in autumn and harvested the following summer, allowed the land to remain productive even in months when most crops lay dormant. In regions prone to unpredictable rainfall or extended cold, rye reduced the risk of complete harvest failure. What rye provided in durability, it lacked in refinement. The bread it produced was dark, coarse, and heavy, compared to the soft white loaves eaten by the nobility, made from finely milled wheat-dried bread, marked one's status. In medieval England and the Low Countries, it was common for peasants to eat muslin bread, a mix of rye and wheat or barley, intended to stretch supplies and avoid waste. The result was dense, chewy, and sometimes sour, especially when left to ferment with wild yeasts. Yet, for all its practicality, rye carried an inherent danger. In wet growing seasons or poorly ventilated storage, it became vulnerable to a toxic fungus, Claviceps purpurea, commonly known as ergot. Consumption of contaminated rye led to ergotism, a condition marked by hallucinations, seizures, gangrene, and death. Known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire, outbreaks occurred sporadically across Europe. In 857, severe cases were reported in the Rhine Valley. In 944, a deadly outbreak in the region around Paris killed thousands. Despite the risk, rye remained indispensable. It was easy to store, could be milled locally, and required fewer inputs than wheat. Its cultivation increased steadily throughout the High Middle Ages, particularly as populations expanded into less fertile lands. By the 13th century, rye bread had become a staple food across much of rural Europe. For those at the bottom of the social order, it was often the only bread available, cheap, filling, and tolerant of poor soil and harsher climates. Rye fed the majority, especially when nothing else would. In medieval Europe, oats held a reputation that varied by region. In wealthier parts of the continent, they were often dismissed as feed for horses and livestock. But in the colder, windswept corners of the British Isles and Northern Europe, oats were a human staple, one of the few grains that could reliably grow in the harshest conditions. Unlike wheat, oats tolerated poor drainage and acidic soil. They required less warmth to germinate and could survive in higher altitudes and shorter summers. These characteristics made oats especially valuable in Scotland, Ireland, and Scandinavia, where frequent rain, limited sunshine, and thin topsoil created challenges for most cereal crops. In these regions, oats often outperformed both rye and barley in terms of yield and reliability. For much of the medieval population living in these zones, oats were not a choice, they were a necessity. Historical records from medieval Scotland describe oat-based farming as the backbone of the rural economy. By the 13th century, oats were one of the most cultivated grains in Scotland, surpassing wheat. In Ireland, too, oats became a key component of everyday nutrition. The Annals of the Four Masters, a chronicle compiled in the 17th century based on earlier sources, frequently referenced oat shortages during times of famine, underscoring the grain's centrality to survival. Oats were typically consumed in simple, functional forms. Porridge boiled oats in water or milk was the standard meal in many peasant homes, often eaten twice a day. In wealthier households, it might be sweetened with honey or fruit. In poorer ones, it was plain and filling. Oats were also used in broths, thickened soups, and flat cakes baked over open fires or on griddles. Their role extended into livestock feed, particularly for draft animals, but this dual use only reinforced their agricultural value. Oats required minimal input and could grow in land unsuitable for higher status crops. They demanded no complex milling and could be prepared quickly, making them accessible for both daily sustenance and storage. Though rarely mentioned in noble inventories or court kitchens, oats sustained countless rural families. In the cold, rain-heavy regions of medieval Europe, oats offered consistency where little else could. They were not prestigious, but they were practical and, in many communities, they were the difference between resilience and hunger. In the medieval diet, where meat was scarce and often reserved for the upper classes, peas provided a crucial source of plant-based protein. They were not just a seasonal food, but a strategic crop that helped sustain families year-round in regions where rainfall was limited and soil quality poor. Peas belonged to the legume family, and their agricultural value extended far beyond nutrition. They required relatively little water compared to leafy vegetables or grain crops, making them ideal for dry or temperate climates. Their growth cycle was short, and they thrived in cool conditions, allowing early spring planting and harvests. Before summer droughts set in parts of northern France, England, and the Low Countries, peas became a common fixture in peasant fields by the High Middle Ages. Once harvested, peas could be dried and stored, often kept for months in sacks or clay jars. This extended their availability well into the winter months, a vital asset in an era without refrigeration or reliable preservation methods. Dried peas were commonly boiled into thick potages, a blend of legumes, grains, and seasonal vegetables that served as a staple meal among laborers and rural families. In monasteries and charitable institutions, peas were frequently listed in records of distributed food. Used to feed the poor or infirm, their value extended to the soil itself. Unlike most other crops, peas restored nitrogen to the land, reducing the need for fallowing. This made them ideal for crop rotation, particularly within the three-field system that became widespread in 12th and 13th century Europe. Farmers would alternate between planting grain, legumes like peas, and leaving a field fallow to maintain fertility and reduce erosion. In this system, peas helped support future harvests without requiring additional resources. Peas also offered flexibility in mixed cultivation. They were often sown between rows of cereals or alongside other legumes to maximize land use. In some regions, field peas were grown not only for human consumption but also as fodder for livestock, contributing to a more integrated farming cycle. Though rarely mentioned in noble feasts or ecclesiastical banquets, peas were essential at the foundation of medieval food security. Their hardiness, nutritional value, and contribution to soil health made them a quiet but powerful force in the survival strategies of Europe's working poor. Beans held a critical position in medieval farming, not because they were prestigious, but because they were practical. In a society where food scarcity was common and soil degradation a constant threat, beans offered both nutrition and restoration. Of the various types grown, the broad bean or fava bean was the most common. Across much of Europe, fava beans originated in the eastern Mediterranean but had spread across Europe by the early medieval period. By the 11th and 12th centuries, they had become a staple in peasant diets from southern England to northern Italy. Their growing requirements were minimal. Fava beans tolerated cool weather and poor soils. They needed little water and could be planted early in the spring or even late winter, allowing harvest before the summer dry season. For rural households, fava beans were a vital protein source. Unlike wheat or barley, which provided mostly carbohydrates, beans added density and balance to the diet. Cooked into stews or mashed into spreads, They were often consumed with coarse bread or mixed with grains to create filling meals. In orders, which often abstained from meat for religious reasons, beans formed a consistent part of the diet, appearing in kitchen records and provisioning rolls, but their real contribution lay in what they gave back to the land. Beans are nitrogen fixers. Their roots house bacteria that convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms usable by plants. This enriched the soil naturally, making beans an essential part of the three-field rotation system that expanded during the High Middle Ages. A field sown with beans one year could support a more demanding cereal crop the next, improving yields without relying on animal manure or chemical amendments. Dried beans also stored well, making them an important fallback in times of scarcity. In periods of famine or siege, stockpiled beans helped stave off starvation. Their high protein content meant that even small amounts could sustain a person through periods of intense labor or deprivation. Beans were not celebrated in medieval poetry or listed on noble menus. They were not associated with wealth, power, or prestige, but they were grown across village plots, monastery gardens, and feudal estates for a reason. They fed the poor, rebuilt the soil, and helped sustain a fragile agricultural system that had to function without modern tools. Quietly, season after season, beans helped keep both people and land alive. In the subsistence gardens of medieval Europe, few crops offered as much practical value as leeks and onions. They were not flashy or rare, but they were consistent, growing where other plants failed, requiring little care and serving multiple functions across diet, storage, and medicine. For peasants without access to fertile land or regular water, these alliums became essential. Both leeks and onions tolerated poor, dry soil. They thrived in well-drained, often neglected corners of gardens where cereals and legumes would falter. Once established, they required little maintenance beyond occasional weeding. In areas with unpredictable rainfall, this resilience made them a low-risk crop, one that could be relied upon even during dry seasons or years when labor was short due to war, plague, or harvest demands. In the medieval diet, these vegetables were used in nearly every type of meal. They added flavor to otherwise bland staples like barley, oats, and peas. Onions were often diced and boiled into thick potager stew made from grains and legumes, served daily in working-class households. Leeks, especially in Celtic regions like Wales and parts of northern England, were used in broths and soups, providing bulk and taste where meat was scarce or unavailable. Beyond the table, these vegetables held medical value. Onions were applied as poultices for wounds, used to draw out infection, and believed to treat everything from headaches to respiratory ailments. Leeks were recommended by medieval herbalists, like Hildegard of Bingen, for their digestive benefits and antibacterial properties. While modern science may dismiss some of these uses, contemporary records show they were part of standard remedies. Across monasteries and lay households alike, one of the most important traits of leeks and onions was their stability. Once dried or braided, onions could last through the winter months with little spoilage. Leeks could be left in the ground and harvested slowly, even through frost, offering a rare source of fresh food during the lean season between late autumn and early spring. In an era without refrigeration or imported produce that made them especially valuable, their cultivation was widespread across Europe by the High Middle Ages. Monastic gardens, manor estates, and peasant plots alike included rows of onions and leeks. They weren't glamorous, but they filled essential roles feeding families. treating illness, and bridging the gap between harvests. In the fragile economy of survival, they were among the most dependable crops medieval farmers had. Among the vegetables that sustained Europe's medieval population, cabbage stood out for its durability, nutritional value, and versatility. It was not a noble crop. It didn't appear on banquet tables in elaborate displays, but in the modest gardens of peasants, monastic compounds, and market towns. Cabbage played a critical role feeding families, preventing nutritional deficiencies, and helping people survive the long winters. Cabbage thrived in conditions where more delicate vegetables failed. It tolerated cold, handled light drought, and could grow in overworked or reused soil with minimal fertilization. In regions where winters were harsh and the growing season was short, cabbage became a reliable choice. In parts of Central and Eastern Europe, where frost arrived early, cabbage often remained one of the last green vegetables available before the ground froze. Its nutritional content made it especially valuable. Cabbage is rich in vitamins, particularly vitamin C, a nutrient that prevented scurvy and supported immune function. In an age before modern medicine, this could mean the difference between survival and chronic illness, particularly during the lean months between harvests. The crop's structure made it ideal for both immediate use and preservation. Fresh cabbage could be shredded into stews, boiled with grains, or eaten raw in regions where customs allowed. But more importantly, it could be fermented preserved as sauerkraut or similar pickled preparations that extended its shelf life through the winter. In German-speaking regions, this method of cabbage preservation became widespread by the late medieval period, offering a source of both nutrients and flavor long after the harvest season ended. Cabbage cultivation also demanded little space. It could be grown in narrow garden strips behind cottages or in communal fields managed by villages or monasteries. Its compact size and low maintenance made it an ideal crop for women and children to tend, especially during times when able-bodied men were pulled away by seasonal labor, feudal obligations, or war. By the 13th century, cabbage was a documented staple across much of Europe. Medieval gardening manuals and estate records from regions like Flanders, northern Italy, and England often listed cabbage among standard crops. In the gardens of monasteries, especially Benedictine and Cistercian, houses cabbage grew alongside leeks, onions, and herbs, feeding not just the monks but the poor and sick who came to these institutions for charity. In a society constantly vulnerable to food insecurity, cabbage provided more than sustenance. It offered consistency, storage potential, and crucial vitamins, all from a plant that asked little from the land. For the medieval peasant, it wasn't just a food, it was a safeguard against hunger and disease. Turnips occupied a modest place in medieval agriculture, but their value far exceeded their status. In a world where failed harvests often led to hunger or displacement, the turnip functioned as a quiet form of insurance, protected beneath the soil from sun, drought, and even war. Their resilience made them ideal for the unpredictable conditions of medieval Europe. Turnips required little more than loosened soil and time. They matured quickly, often within 2 months, and could be grown in fields, gardens, or even as a secondary crop between cereal harvests. Their underground growth shielded them from the direct effects of heat and weather extremes, making them a dependable source of food when above-ground crops failed. Both the root and the leafy tops were edible. The bulbous root offered carbohydrates and some vitamin C, while the greens could be cooked into potages or boiled alongside grains and pulses. For poor families, this meant a single plant could stretch across multiple meals. In regions like northern France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany, turnips became a common feature in both rural plots and larger estate gardens by the 12th century. Turnips also served a crucial dual purpose. In addition to feeding people, they fed animals. The tops were used as fodder for pigs, sheep, and cattle, especially during the colder months when grass was unavailable. The roots could also be lifted and stored in cool cellars, or left in the ground and harvested as needed throughout the winter, making them one of the few fresh foods available deep into the cold season. Their role during famine years was especially significant. When cereal crops failed, whether from drought, flooding, or pest infestation, turnips often survived. They provided emergency calories and helped stave off mass starvation. Chroniclers noted their presence during times of dearth. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which devastated much of northern Europe, root crops like turnips were among the few remaining food sources available to commoners. Though they could not prevent hardship, they lessened the collapse of food security. By the late Middle Ages, turnips were integrated into crop rotation strategies, especially in regions adopting the three-field system. Their cultivation not only provided food, but helped loosen and refresh the soil for more demanding crops. Turnips rarely appeared in aristocratic kitchens, but they were fundamental to the survival of the medieval poor. Hardy, versatile, and hidden safely beneath the earth, they offered one of the few agricultural safeguards in a precarious and unforgiving era. In the agricultural landscape of medieval Europe, millet played a role that modern memory has largely erased, though it is rarely mentioned in chronicles or preserved in noble accounts. Millet was, for centuries, a vital grain, particularly in Eastern and Southern Europe. It grew where others couldn't, matured quickly, and offered a flexible source of calories in both settled and subsistence economies. Millet's resilience set it apart. It thrived in dry, sandy soils with minimal rainfall, making it especially valuable in regions with unpredictable or limited water supplies. In areas affected by the Mediterranean climate, southern Italy, parts of the Balkans, and the Iberian Peninsula, millet remained one of the few grains that could reliably grow. During dry spells in Eastern Europe, particularly in what is now Hungary, Romania, and parts of Ukraine, millet was cultivated extensively well into the late medieval period. Its short growing season, often under 3 months, meant that it could be sown and harvested between major crop cycles, or even used as a fallback when primary cereal crops failed. Archaeobotanical evidence confirms millet's presence across early medieval settlements from the 9th to the 13th centuries. In some areas, especially among lower social classes, millet was not just a supplementary crop, it was the staple dot in the kitchen. Millet was versatile. It was boiled into gruel or porridge, a standard peasant meal often mixed with herbs or vegetables. It could also be ground into flour and used for flatbreads, especially in areas where wheat or rye were scarce. In some regions of Central and Southeastern Europe, millet was used in brewing, producing a light, fermented beverage that served as a local alternative to barley-based ale. Despite its practicality, millet's status began to decline by the late Middle Ages, as feudal systems became more organized and long-distance grain trade expanded. Wheat began to dominate both culturally and economically. Wheat bread became associated with wealth, refinement, and Christian liturgical practices. particularly in Western Europe. Over time, millet's reputation suffered. It was increasingly viewed as a poor person's grain of food of the margins, both geographically and socially. By the 16th century, millet cultivation had significantly decreased in many parts of Western Europe, replaced by wheat, barley, and eventually maize following its introduction from the Americas. But for hundreds of years prior, millet had quietly sustained entire communities, offering food security where more fragile grains could not. Millet's disappearance from the historical spotlight doesn't erase its legacy. It fed villages, endured droughts, and filled bellies long before industrial agriculture existed. In the fragile subsistence economy of medieval farming, millet was a dependable, overlooked essential grain in the background of survival. In the agricultural routine of medieval Europe, cultivated crops were central, but they were never the full story. When the harvest failed, when the fields yielded to little, or when famine struck, survival often came from the margins, hedgerows, forests, meadows, and riverbanks. Foraged wild greens and herbs, overlooked in formal records, were a quiet but essential part of the medieval diet and medicinal practices. Among the most commonly gathered wild greens were nettles, dandelions, sorrel goosefoot, and chickweed. These plants needed no tending. They grew in abundance across fallow fields, ditches, and woodland edges, requiring no irrigation, plowing, or fertilization. In a time when labor was limited and most arable land was reserved for grain production, the ability to collect these plants freely and without cost was a major asset to the peasant household. Nettles, despite their sting, were highly valued. Boiled or blanched, they provided iron, calcium, and vitamin C. Dandelions were equally common. Their leaves added to soups and potages for both nutrition and variety. Sorrel, with its tangy flavor, was one of the few wild greens with culinary appeal beyond subsistence. It was used not only in peasant kitchens but occasionally in monastic and noble preparations. These greens supplemented the diets of those with little access to meat, dairy, or even legumes during lean years. Their role became especially prominent during periods of famine, such as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when failed grain harvests across northern Europe forced communities to rely on every available food source. In such years, foraged greens weren't an addition, they were the core of survival. Wild herbs also played a central role in medieval medicine. Monasteries, where medical knowledge was preserved and practiced, recorded the use of wild plants in treatments. Nettles were believed to stimulate circulation. Sorrel was used to cool fevers. Plantain and comfrey were applied to wounds. For many villagers, knowledge of local plants passed down orally or learned through trial was the only healthcare available. Though these greens left few traces in official documents, their absence from the historical spotlight belies their importance. In villages without markets, during years without wheat, or in households without coin, the forest edge became a source of life. Wild plants required no permission to gather, no tithe to the Lord, and no tools to harvest. They simply grew, waiting to be picked. For the medieval poor, this unplanted harvest was not an afterthought. It was a lifeline in the economic life of the medieval peasant. Few crops offered as much functional diversity as flax, grown in modest garden plots and larger communal fields alike. Flax was more than a textile plant, it was a source of food, fabric, and income. It thrived in cool climates with moderate moisture, often requiring less water than grains or vegetables, and became a cornerstone of rural survival and domestic industry across much of Europe. From the 9th to 15th centuries, the entire flax plant had value. Its seeds, small, brown, and oily, were harvested and crushed to produce linseed oil. This oil served multiple purposes. It was used in cooking, as a lamp fuel, and in medicinal preparations. In times when animal fats were scarce or expensive, linseed oil offered a plant-based alternative for both diet and practical needs. Although it was not a major staple, it contributed calories and essential fatty acids to a diet often lacking in variety. But it was the stem of the flax plant that held the most long-term value. Through a labor-intensive process that included retting, drying, breaking, and combing, flax fibers were extracted and spun into linen thread. This thread was then woven into linen cloth, lightweight, breathable, and long-lasting. Linen became the fabric of everyday life for peasants, monks, and merchants, while the nobility favored wool and silk. Linen clothed the majority of Europe's population. Flax cultivation and processing were often managed by women. In peasant households, spinning and weaving linen were not side tasks, they were part of a broader economic strategy. Finished linen could be sold or traded in local markets, offered as part of dowries, or exchanged for essential goods such as salt, tools, or grain. In parts of Flanders and northern France, flax production became an organized cottage industry by the 13th century, laying the groundwork for the region's later textile boom. Even small-scale flax growing played a part in this economic chain. Monasteries encouraged its cultivation in their surrounding villages, and urban textile guilds eventually sourced raw fibers from rural communities. Flax linked the agricultural world to the early commercial economy, connecting peasant gardens to merchant warehouses. By the late Middle Ages, linen made from flax had become so common that inventories from even modest estates often listed linen, garments and household items among their assets. Flax, once harvested from soil with minimal inputs, had become a means of both survival and modest advancement. In a world defined by subsistence, it was one of the few crops that offered not just nourishment or clothing, but possibility. In the working gardens of medieval Europe, herbs held a place of quiet importance. They required little space, survived in poor or dry soils, and offered more than just flavor. For peasant families, monastic infirmaries, and traveling healers, herbs like sage, thyme, garlic, and rosemary became staples, not just of the kitchen, but of survival and daily care. Many of these herbs were originally native to the Mediterranean basin, adapted to endure sun-scorched slopes and thin, stony ground. Their drought resistance made them ideal for cultivation in the often parched gardens of southern and central Europe, though by the high Middle Ages they had spread into northern regions through trade, conquest, and monastic transmission. Garlic, for example, had been in cultivation since at least Roman times. By the 11th century, it was common across much of Europe, planted in small garden plots or in the narrow strips of land behind cottages. These herbs played a key role in the medieval diet. In a world without refrigeration and where food preservation often relied on salt or smoke, strong-tasting herbs provided necessary enhancement for otherwise bland or spoiled meals. Sage and thyme were used in stews, grain pottages, and meat preservation. Garlic was crushed and added to vegetable dishes, or rubbed onto stale bread. Parsley and savory were used when available in spring and summer. Even dried, these herbs could be stored for months, often hanging in bundles from rafters or tucked into cloth sacks. Beyond the kitchen, Herbs formed the backbone of medieval medicine. Manuscripts from monastic hospitals, including those of the Benedictines and Cistercians, list dozens of common herbs used in treatment. Sage was believed to strengthen memory and digestion. Thyme was applied to wounds to prevent infection. Garlic was used for respiratory ailments and as a general tonic against illness. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess and medical writer, included these herbs in her extensive treatises on healing, describing their properties in detail. The cultivation of herbs required little land, which made them especially suited to small-space gardening. Women who managed many of the household gardens passed down knowledge of herb use and preservation from generation to generation. In urban areas, apothecaries began to organize around the trade in dried herbs by the 14th century, linking the rural herb grower to the growing medical economy of the towns, though not often listed in tax rolls or grain accounts. Herbs were quietly indispensable. They flavored the food of the poor, treated the wounds of soldiers, and filled the shelves of monastic pharmacies. In a time when access to doctors was rare and ingredients were limited, these hardy plants growing in dry soil offered control, knowledge, and resilience planted by hand, passed down in memory, and used in both life and death. By the 9th century, European farmers had begun to adopt techniques that modern agriculture would later define as foundational. Among these was the three-field system, a practice of crop rotation that significantly improved food security and soil fertility. Far from primitive subsistence, these methods reveal an understanding of land stewardship rooted in experience and necessity. In earlier centuries, the two-field system dominated. One half of the arable land was planted, while the other rested. Fallow. But by the High Middle Ages, especially in regions of northern France, the Low Countries, and the Rhineland, the shift to a three-field rotation allowed farmers to cultivate 2/3 of their land annually. One field would host winter crops like wheat or rye. A second would grow spring crops such as barley, oats, or legumes, and the third would lie fallow. The rotation was not random, it was based on empirical observation of soil depletion and recovery, balancing the nutritional needs of crops with the regenerative capacity of the land. This system not only reduced the risk of total harvest failure, but improved yields over time. Leguminous crops, like peas and beans, were included not merely for dietary diversity, but because of their ability to fix nitrogen in the soil. This enriched the earth for future grain planting. Fields left fallow were often grazed by livestock, whose manure further replenished nutrients. Companion planting, though not formally theorized in medieval Europe, was practiced through intercropping and garden mixing. Peas, for example, were often grown near cereals, where their climbing vines could use standing stalks for support. In small garden plots, herbs like sage or onions were mixed among vegetables, potentially deterring pests. Such arrangements were not born from abstract theory, but from generations of observation. When a certain combination improved yield or resisted disease, it was remembered and repeated. Even within the constraints of feudal obligation and climatic uncertainty, medieval peasants were not blindly tilling soil. They adjusted planting patterns in response to local weather trends, soil conditions, and available livestock. Monastic farms, especially Benedictine and Cistercian estates, often led in agricultural experimentation, documenting results and transferring knowledge between abbeys. Some innovations were later adopted by lay communities. The intelligence embedded in these systems was practical and adaptive. Crop rotation allowed communities to avoid depleting their narrow margins of fertile land. Mixed planting diversified the food base and mitigated risk. These techniques, gradually refined over generations, formed the backbone of medieval rural sustainability in times when a failed harvest could mean hunger, and when every seed counted. The choices made in the fields were shaped by more than tradition. They were born of hard-earned knowledge, patterns seen, remembered, and passed down. Across the drought-hardened fields of medieval Europe, survival did not rely on luck. It depended on wisdom earned through repetition, failure, and adaptation. In a time before chemical fertilizers, diesel plows, or weather forecasts, the medieval peasants stood against nature with little more than hand tools, experience, and memory. And yet, over centuries, they endured. This endurance was not passive. It was marked by decisions: what to plant, where to plant, when to rest the soil, and how to use every part of every crop. The grain rotations, the cultivation of hardy legumes, the saving of seeds, and the reliance on herbs, wild plants, and household gardening were not signs of backwardness. They were the foundation of a subsistence system that sustained entire populations through war, famine, climate shifts, and plague, even in the worst conditions. When rainfall failed or soil eroded, the knowledge of how to survive persisted. Families turned to crops that needed little: oats that grew in poor soil, peas that revived the land, wild greens that waited in the hedgerows. These choices weren't born from abundance, but from generations of accumulated experience. The simple act of planting turnips or drying leeks for winter was a calculated response to scarcity. Centuries later, many of these strategies still inform practices in regions where industrial agriculture cannot reach. Crop rotation, refined over time, is now a standard part of sustainable farming. Nitrogen-fixing legumes remain essential in regenerative agriculture. Companion planting, herbal medicine, water conservation techniques, and small plot gardening are still taught, especially in areas vulnerable to climate shocks. What was once necessity has become methodology. Even the cultural memory of food security is rooted in these fields. In modern seed-saving initiatives and community gardens, the same logic applies: diversify, conserve, observe, and adjust. Monastic records from the 12th and 13th centuries still guide some organic growing manuals today, not for nostalgia, but because those records captured workable solutions developed without modern infrastructure, the legacy of medieval drought-proof farming is not in the tools they lacked, but in the solutions they forged. These were systems built not by institutions, but by ordinary people, by laborers, women, monks, and villagers who understood that survival would never be guaranteed, but could be earned through strategy and care. The peasant fields of the past were never silent. They held knowledge in the spacing of crops, in the timing of harvests, in the overlooked weeds that doubled as food and cure. And though centuries have passed, and machines now till the same earth, those lessons remain, buried in the soil, ready to grow again wherever hardship makes the land feel dry.